Fam, we have a guest here, a special guest. You want to introduce?
Yeah. So, breaking news: our special guest is Scott Ritter, and Scott Ritter was just banned on Twitter again.
No.
And I didn't know this because I had just seen him on Twitter a few hours ago, I thought.
So did I.
So, welcome, Scott. What the hell? What's going on?
Only Twitter knows. I mean, there's theory. Clearly, it's not anything I tweeted. When they let me back on, there was no preconditions. I had refused to delete tweets that they had found offensive, which was one of the reasons why this drama dragged on. And they just up and reinstated it, which meant that every tweet that I had sent out previously was clearly legal.
Right.
But then I was testing the system, as I always do, because I don't trust Elon Musk. I don't trust Twitter. I don't trust the system. So I simply retweeted the original offending tweet. And now but in talking to people, the other thing that happened, as soon as I came on, my account was swarmed by these NAFO, bots and whatever. And they, of course, every tweet you send out, they just flood Twitter with complaints. And I'm just guessing that some low-level Twitter, one of their highly paid PhD social media experts. And what I mean by that is, somebody with a third grade education simply panicked and said, delete this guy because we're getting flooded with complaints, which is the NAFO tactic. And, I've said all along that Musk has a NAFO problem, that if he wants to fix Twitter, he needs to bring those Shiba Inus to heel.
Yeah. Fam, I just wanted to mention too as well, Scott, I was interested. We were talking about, hey, how about we get Scott Ritter and Scott Horton on the same show together and call it to Two Scotts? And it's just interesting because Scott Horton, once again, I think you're a lot like him as far as like, I don't believe that you could call you a 9/11 truther, right? Like you're not filled in the truth of conspiracy theory kind of network, where a lot of people, when they were taking people down, they were saying the conspiracy theories that they were putting up there. You stay far away from that stuff. Same as with Horton. I've never seen you in that arena before. Why do you think they did take you down? Do you think this is completely just about the geopolitics here?
Well, yeah, I frankly speaking, I think it's purely about the geopolitics. I have been heavily targeted by the Center for Countering Disinformation, which is a Ukrainian government entity created, funded by the U.S. government, supported by the State Department. Not only have they put me on a blacklist, calling me an information terrorist, a war criminal worthy of being arrested and prosecuted as such, they've transferred my name over to what's called the Mirotvorets list, which is the peacekeeper list run by the Ukrainian Special Services, which is a hit list. They kill people on this list. And we see them in action. Just last Friday, I did an event here at the local library, and they tried to shut it down. They sent these operatives in who shouted down, it disrupted the events, brought in local media to try and discredit what we were doing, et cetera. It backfired on them because the video that of the event has been seen 120,000 times, and the more than 3,000 comments that are made, with the exception of fewer than 5, are all positive towards the position I had taken. So it backfired, but in the process of doing that, the whole NAFO Ukrainian crowd swarmed everything about me. Anybody affiliated with me. I was supposed to speak on Sunday at the Russian Samovar restaurant. It was a big book event that was done up that's been in planning for months. And unfortunately, yesterday I was notified by the Russian Samovar that they had to cancel because they had received so many phone calls, that they feared for the success of their business, for the survival of their business. So, there is cancel culture out there. It's not a conspiracy theory. I don't have to pretend. I don't have to make anything up. It's there. It's alive. It's well. It's living. And I am 100% convinced that my Twitter account was a victim of the same thing.
All right. So I guess my question's gonna go into a little bit of what you are censored with for a lot, which is of what you've been saying about Russia, Ukraine. Now, where we're at, what we've been seeing the last few days is Ukraine just getting pummeled, right? Getting completely pummeled. And also, we saw one of the daughters of one of the Ukrainian elite just partying with champagne while all of this is happening. We've also seen the United States ramp up, of course, their attempts to give more weapons and more weapons. Billions and billions were just approved in Congress for more. Where are we right now in this conflict? Where are we as far as where Ukraine is? Because a lot of the rumors have been suggesting that this is just, I mean, now it's really, really bad for Ukraine.
Well, it's been bad for Ukraine for some time now. It's been bad for Ukraine, I would say, since April. It's amazing how people don't know how to put things into a proper perspective. The Russians kicked off their special military operation, I think, with some bad perceptions about how reality was on the ground. It's clear that they thought that they could accomplish a lot with a little. They went in with 200,000 troops, and they went in thinking that there was going to be less resistance than there was, and there was more resistance, and it turned out they had insufficient troops to accomplish what they were seeking to accomplish. So they transitioned from phase 1 to phase 2, which was to solely focus on the Donbass, and they were doing the meat grinder. The success we're seeing at Bakhmut and Soledar today were successes that were taking place in May, in June. But then the United States injected, tens of billions of dollars of equipment and assistance into Ukraine, providing literal lifeline. And that was a game-changing event. And we saw, once Ukraine received, the largesse, the weaponry and the troops that were trained, that the Russians didn't have enough troops to man a 1,500 kilometer frontage. The Ukrainians were able to penetrate, and the Russians had to pull back and consolidate. That's what happened in September and October. They appointed a new commander, General Surovikin, and his job was to stabilize the front. And he has done that. And but when we talk about all this, the counteroffensives and all that, the one consistent that has been in place since May is that Ukrainian troops are dying in droves. No matter how you want to draw arrows on a map, each day Ukrainian corpses are piling higher and higher and higher. That has not changed. And an army can only absorb so many casualties before there is an impact on its ability to, fight in a coherent fashion. The Ukrainians have suffered horrific losses. Their burn rate, which is how I refer to not just human casualties, but their equipment casualties, is extraordinarily high. Their replenishment rate is extraordinarily low. The Russians, on the other hand, have a low burn rate, high replenishment rate. And so we're looking right now, Surovikin has accomplished his mission. He solidified the front. He stabilized the front. He has created the conditions for a successful next phase of the operation, which I believe will be a decisive phase, because Russia has accrued all of the advantages. But now we see Gerasimov taking over, Surovikin becoming a deputy. How did that happen? Why did you take the commander and make him a deputy? Because the scope and scale of Russia's military involvement is about to expand. I think that we're going to see things happening in Ukraine that are show that Russia is deadly serious about finishing this task of demilitarization, denazification. And that's where we are. But Ukraine has suffered just horrific casualties. And the other thing I'd like to point out, though, is that when we talk about military math, we can say Ukraine suffered horrific casualties, and we make it sound like it's a one-sided fight. then we can say things like the casualty ratios are, 1 to 6, 1 to 8, 1 to 10. So for every dead Russian, you have 6, 8, or 10 dead Ukrainians. Well, that makes it sound okay too for Russia. If Ukrainians are suffering 1,000 dead a day, and the best kill ratio is 1 to 10, that's 100 dead Russians a day. The United States lost the will to fight in Vietnam, losing 200 plus men a week. Russia, on its best week, winning all the victories that it is suffering 500 to 700 dead a week. A week. People need to let that sink in. This war ain't cheap. This war ain't easy. This is the most horrific thing Europe has experienced since the Second World War. Nothing's come close to it. So even though we talk about Ukraine getting pummeled, Ukraine getting beat, I think we also need to reflect on the fact that this comes with a cost, a very heavy burden for the Russian people, for the Russian command, for the Russian leadership, for the Russian nation. And it's something in the West we just, because we've trivialized this conflict so much. We've turned it into a meme. We've done everything except talk about the reality of it. And we're at the point, where, now it seems, that everything that people have been saying about Ukraine's demise, is coming true. You can't spin it away. And so a lot of emphasis is placed on the suffering of Ukraine, and Ukraine is suffering a lot. So is Russia. And we should never forget that point.
Well, let's look at the math real quick, because it's a very interesting point you just brought up, right? That Ukraine is suffering some serious casualties. Okay. How long can the Ukrainians last under these conditions? And when will Kiev fall? Because we can keep supplying weaponry, and we are supplying some troops. It's obvious we've seen NATO troops on the ground. The West has been going in there. I think they've also outsourced some of the troops to these mercenary groups, and they can go in there for a while. We have enough money to pay for them to have that going. But how long until the math just it can be no longer? Ukrainians have run out of troops. They have run out of people willing to fight this war. And even though the price has been paid is a high price for Russia to pay, which you just pointed out, how much longer can the Ukrainians last under these conditions, Scott?
Look, we're being told by NATO and Ukraine that anywhere from 40 to 70,000 Ukrainian troops are in a training pipeline in NATO in the Western countries. And we've been told that there are, new tranches of equipment coming in, Bradley fighting vehicles, the Martyr, things of that nature, AMX-10 light tanks, potentially other tanks as well. But when you put down the calendar of this, let's take, for instance, the Patriot missile system, the single battery that the United States is providing. Ukrainian troops have to go to Fort Sill or to White Sands Missile Testing Range in Texas to receive the training necessary to operate that. It takes 5 months. So the Patriot isn't going to be deployed into Ukraine until May at the earliest, probably June, maybe later. So you put that down on the calendar. When are the Bradley fighting vehicles going to be ready? Because they have to be brought out of storage. They have to be brought up to proper maintenance, etc. Meanwhile, Ukrainian troops have to be trained to operate that. So let's say April, the same thing with the Martyr. My point is, everything Ukraine's being provided is not going to arrive on the battlefield at the same time. It's going to come in staggered. So why do I bring this up? And the same thing with the troops being trained. They're going to come in staggered as well. When Russia starts its counteroffensive, which I believe will be sometime in early February, they are going to be, I believe, putting tremendous stress on the Ukrainian system. There's going to be fighting on multiple fronts, very intense fighting. It's not going to be localized fighting like only Bakhmut, only Soledar. There's going to be, a very widespread, broad-scale fighting, which is going to consume the Ukrainians, consume them. And why is this important? As long as Russia can maintain this pressure, this burn rate going on, as these Ukrainian troops come in from their training pipeline, as this equipment comes in, the Ukrainians aren't going to be able to hold it back and bring everybody into a consolidated strike force, they're going to have to commit these troops immediately in piecemeal fashion. And they're just going to get ground down too. And and the reason why I bring all this up is that's Ukraine's strategic reserve right now. That's the force they claim they need to win the war against Russia. That's the force they claim that if they can bring it together and consolidate it. You remember General Zaluzhny's comments to The Economist about give me 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, and I can win the war. Well, the West is trying to give them that. But Russia is not going to give them a chance to put all of that into a single strike force. It's going to be committed piecemeal into a war that Russia, if it maintains the pressure, will be dictating the terms. And this means that strategic reserve is going to be destroyed before it ever had a chance to do what it's intended to do. And once it's gone, there's nothing left. There's literally nothing left. And at that point, Russia wins. Now, the problem for Russia is that while they do have sufficient resources to do the task I just explained, the point is Ukraine's a big country. What happens when Russia liberates all of the Donbass? That extends its frontage. Why is that important? Because for every kilometer of frontage that you add, you have to put 200 men on, 250 men on. So now as you start to extend your frontage from 1 kilometer, you extend it 500 kilometers, 1,000 kilometer extension of the frontage requires 250,000 troops to man. Russia only mobilized 300,000. They may have another 120,000 volunteers in the pipeline, maybe a few more, in addition to the 180,000 they already have deployed on this thing. Russia has enough troops to do a specific task that may include recapturing Kharkov, that may include conquering all of the 4 districts that have been absorbed and expanding beyond that, maybe taking Nikolaev, maybe taking Odessa. But that's it. Everybody keeps going Kiev, Kiev, Kiev. Kiev is a city of 5 million. Russia, in order to take that, Russia is going to have to commit 250, 300,000 troops that they don't have. So I think that we're looking at 2 phases of this conflict. One is the destruction of the main Ukrainian military, which Russia's getting ready to do. And I think that will be accomplished by the end of summer, early fall. But then there's going to be a political phase where Ukraine has to be compelled to accept unconditional terms of surrender that bring about the denazification element of that. And that's going to be a more tricky proposition because I don't believe Russia can't make the same mistake they already made, which is to overextend its forces, create gaps in its defensive line that can be exploited by a Ukrainian counterattack. So I think that while the Ukrainian army is going to be defeated this year, the political defeat of Ukraine, I think, is going to be a longer proposition that's going to factor in a lot of economic woes. And the thing that's going to kill Ukraine is next winter, not this winter, next one. If Ukraine still exists, it won't exist after next winter. It won't exist as a nation state.
Well, I just want to really follow up really quick, fam, because I know you'll have something to say about this as well. When I ask when will Kiev fall, I'm not really saying when will the Russians take Kiev. It's just that we understand the tactics that have been implied and used by the Zelensky government as soon as they got into power in 2014. And it's more of a terrorist guerrilla warfare where we see these pictures inside the Donbass region where they're attacking civilians. So even if we beat their standing army, Scott, aren't we going to have to deal with these type of tactics in that in some way or the other, maybe not militarily, but politically, there has to be a change in Kiev? Otherwise, how can the people of the Donbass ever sleep peacefully?
Well, remember, this is more than the Donbass. This is Russia. This is about Russia sleeping peacefully. The Donbass is part of Russia now. Yeah. So this is a Russian conflict, not a Donbass conflict. And what Russia can't do is allow a festering cancerous wound to exist long term. Russia has to solve this problem. And I think the solution is going to come from within Ukraine. I think Russia, again, I don't pick up the phone and call Putin or Gerasimov or Shoigu or Lavrov. I wish I could. I wish I had that influence.
He might be able to do that. Fam, can you get on the horn with them? No.
Yeah, then get them to answer. But so I have no clue. I'm just, this is just an assessment. But because I believe that this war, this conflict, has both a military and a political component to it, that the Russians are going to shape the military battle that maximizes the potential for political settlement. And Putin provided some sort of, I believe, insight into the thinking of the Russians when he answered a question by a Hungarian journalist last fall at the Valdai conference that he had. The Hungarian journalist asked him sort of tongue-in-cheek, when's a good time to visit Odessa? And Putin said sooner rather than later. But then he went on and summarize his comments. He alluded to the fact that Odessa was going to be the key to either the peaceful resolution of this conflict or the center of the defeat, the decisive defeat of Ukraine. So I've come up with a concept that I call the Odessa moment, meaning that I believe Russia has sufficient military force to liberate the totality of the Donbass, to retake Kherson, retake Zaporizhia, all of the territories, to probably take Kharkiv or Kharkov, and then push the Ukrainians back before pausing at Nikolaev and telling the Ukrainians, this is your last chance. Surrender now, get rid of the Nazi regime, and we will allow you continued access to the sea. We will allow you to have viability as a modern nation state. Should you turn us down, should you insist on continuing to fight, then we will take Odessa, link up with Transnistria, and you will be forever a landlocked agricultural rump state. And that's your future. And I think at that point in time, Ukraine will come under tremendous pressure from the West that recognizes the inevitability of Ukrainian collapse, the inability of NATO to sustain the conflict, and Zelensky will be removed, and somebody who is capable of sitting on the table and accepting those terms will be put in. That's one way I see this shaping up.
On the other hand, though, the United States and NATO, of course, continue to supply weapons, and while simultaneously, for instance, the United States does deny that they are fighting a proxy war against Russia, the Raytheon CEO admitted that that they are giving Ukraine real-time intel on Russian troops. I mean, this was admitted. So while they're saying, oh, we're not actually fighting a proxy war against Russia, they're providing obviously not just weapons and billions in aid, but now direct intel on these Russian troops. So how much longer can the United States and NATO just continue saying, oh, hey, we're just, we're just helping Ukraine. We have to help Ukraine. I mean, Zelensky was on the Golden Globes video feed today because he's Zelensky. I mean, this has been happening since the beginning of the conflict, but now what you're seeing is more people catching on to it, whether it's because of you and other people that are have been speaking out in independent media, whether it's because it's tiring now, especially in the United States where the state of affairs of the economy isn't good, especially in Europe with the high cost of electricity and power. So how much longer can this be denied in those terms by the United States when everybody's figuring out, oh, there's intel. Oh, Twitter is obviously, manipulating this in favor of Ukraine. Oh, all of these revelations are happening.
Look, what you're describing is what I call information warfare. I mean, it's real, especially the intelligence. The intelligence provided by the United States has a definite lethality aspect to it, meaning that the Ukrainians are able to use that intelligence to better target Russian forces and inflict more harm on Russia. But the Russian approach from the very beginning of this conflict has been one of escalation management. I mean, Russia has done everything in their power to prevent this conflict from spinning out of control. They didn't overreact when the Crimea bridge was struck. They didn't overreact when Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were blown up. They haven't overreacted. They've responded in a measured yet escalatory fashion, but the escalation has been, predictable, etc. I think that Russia is not going to lose sight of its ultimate objective, which is to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. The biggest mistake Russia could make would be to overreact to something and bring NATO into the conflict. That would be self-defeating in terms of the victory that Russia is almost assured of getting in Ukraine, and it could be life-terminating for everybody if the conflict goes nuclear. So I think the Russians are seeking to manage that. Look, from the United States perspective, understand this. We were providing the Afghan government with billions of dollars of equipment as of late July, early August 2021. When the end was there, we were still deluding ourselves into, we've got this under control. Here's the equipment. Here's more helicopters. Here's more aircraft. Here's more guns. Here's more this. Here's more that. And then we walked away, because that's what we do. We walk away. I mean, I've been trying to explain to the pro-Ukrainian crowd as much as I can that the United States is not the friend of Ukraine. We don't care about Ukraine. We don't like Ukraine. We're using Ukraine. When Lindsey Graham says we want to fight to the last Ukrainian, that's exactly what we want to do. If we cared about Ukraine, we would never tolerate what's happening. We'd never allowed what's happening right now in terms of their infrastructure, the destruction of their infrastructure. We wouldn't allow Ukraine to sacrifice, basically the genetic material of its future, all of its manpower dying on the battlefield. Think of the generations that are lost now because of this conflict. But we're not. We don't like Ukraine. We don't care about Ukraine. We're using Ukraine, and so is NATO. Ukraine will never become a member of NATO. We've known that from day one. We only sought to bring them in to create this very crisis that has been provoked so that we could weaken Russia, we could strain Russia, we could remove Putin from power, and we could begin the process of breaking Russia up into various component fiefdoms, which is something we've been trying to do since the 1990s. No one likes Ukraine, no one. And so the Ukrainians need to come to that understanding that there will come a time when the West is going to tire of them and just walk away.
Yeah.
They're going to do the Pontius Pilate. They're going to wash their hands, and Ukrainians are going to get crucified. And it's very tragic. It's very sad, but it's very real.
Yeah. Well, with that being said, Ukraine is also one of the most corrupt places on the face of the earth. There's a lot of weapon smuggling, human smuggling, sex trafficking, the whole 9 yards. When I think about the weapons and I think about what you just said, I think that a lot of Ukrainians are going to catch on and understand that the West is not their friend. I think that a lot of people within Kiev realize that right now. With that being said, is there any chance for an organic coup inside of Ukraine taking place? In other words, them just taking this matter into their own hands, saying, listen, we need the West out of here. We need to broker a deal with Russia. We need to get rid of Zelensky. Is there any chance, or is the West so fortified and their claws are so deep inside of Kiev that there's no chance of these people standing up for their own sovereignty? What are your thoughts there, Scott?
Well, I don't think there's going to be a Maidan. I don't think there's going to be a rush of Ukrainian civilians rushing the presidency to get rid of Zelensky. The coup, I believe, is going to come from within the military. One thing you can say about military men and women is they serve their nation. They love their nation. Regardless. Even in Nazi Germany, the Wehrmacht soldiers who weren't Nazis loved Germany and were willing to fight and defend Germany. Not Nazi ideology, but Germany, the German homeland. And this, again, comes to why I'm such a big proponent of what I call the Odessa moment. Because the Odessa moment that I described is a come to Jesus moment for the Ukrainian military. That they've been led down this path of national self-destruction by NATO and the West, and by a presidency that caters solely to the interest of NATO and the West. And if you present Ukraine with an Odessa moment that the president, Zelensky, is unable or unwilling for any number of reasons to take advantage of, I do believe at that point in time, military officers who know the truth, who know that this is irreversible in terms of the Russian victory, that continued resistance is futile, that all you're going to do is destroy the nation further, just kill thousands more men and lose more territory, that some general officers will take matters into their own hands, and either they will exile Zelensky or they'll give him the 75-cent solution, which is the cost of one 9mm bullet in the back of his head. And I do believe that is the that is the future for Zelensky. He's either going to be forced out of office and given the chance to live abroad in one of his mansions, or he's going to be killed should he seek to stay on. But we already see the West is walking away from Zelensky. We see that in just the way that media coverage is focusing now on Zaluzhny and other Ukrainian generals as being the heroes. The defense ministry is taking front stage, and Zelensky, yes, he was recently trotted out for his services to assist Congress in justifying a lame duck session to vote in $65 million worth of aid. But today he's not much of a factor anymore. He's not as useful as he once was. The generals are becoming more useful, and I think the generals are the future for Ukraine in terms of conflict resolution.
And my last question, because I can tell you're not feeling well. For the longest time, a lot of people have been asking why Russia went in, and this has been talked about ad nauseum. Could they have avoided something? Where is the anti-war movement? Why is nobody talking about peace? Why is nobody why are so many people kind of taking sides in this war and being cheerleaders either for Russia or Ukraine without regard to human life? And I see that sentiment mainly coming from a lot of people in the West, a lot of people who consider themselves anti-imperialist. Is there any sort of I don't want to say like reason, but is there any sort of value, any sort of validity in understanding that by fighting NATO, essentially, which is what Russia's doing, via Ukraine, which is what's being used to wage this proxy war against Russia, that is kind of a push against the empire? Because I mean, it is from the Russian perspective, it's an existential fight for Russia as we understand it, but many don't understand that. Many say that it's still violent, that Russia doesn't have to do this, that maybe if they would just go back to the negotiating table, even though we've seen, here, that Russia has tried time and time again to negotiate. Of course, negotiate doesn't mean you just let NATO and the United States and their allies walk all over you. So there's that sentiment still with people, though, like, this has to end. Russians are dying, as you mentioned. Ukrainians are dying. War isn't pretty, obviously. There's no need to glorify it. But is there any sort of validity to that sentiment that if you're an anti-war person, you should be demanding everything stop and that peace happen?
Well, I mean, first of all, the American anti-war movement crashed and burned after the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. It just disappeared. And it has not been able to successfully reconstitute itself since that time. And even within the anti-war movement, many of the anti-war activists are proponents of what they call the just war theory, meaning that if there's going to be a war, it has to be a just war. And a key component of just war is that you don't invade another nation. And so they just reject out of hand any notion of Russia's legitimacy in action by saying Russia invaded, so therefore Russia's at fault. I had an interesting exchange with someone where I brought up, Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which of course is one of the two conditions under which nations are allowed to go to war under international law. First being in defense of a Chapter 7 resolution passed by the Security Council that identifies a threat of such magnitude that military force is authorized to eliminate or neutralize that threat. We saw a Chapter 7 resolution used to justify Operation Desert Storm in 1991 after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Article 51 is self-defense. That is, that a nation has an inherent right to defend itself if attacked. Russia has articulated a case for its actions in Ukraine under Article 51. And most, unfortunately, most peace activists aren't, international lawyers or experts in the legal aspects of the legality of war. If they were, then they would know that Article 51, even though it speaks of self-defense, incorporates what's known as preemptive self-defense as a legitimate course of action. That is, that if a threat exists of such a magnitude and of such eminence that if you wait for them to attack, you will be disadvantaged, that you have a right to preempt this threat. Under international law, this is quantified in what they call the Caroline Affair, which was an American ship, I think, in 1848, trying to smuggle Canadian rebels and guns into what was then British Canada. And the ship was intercepted by the British Navy. And the United States said, you attacked us. And the British made a case saying, no, we acted in self-defense, but we had to preempt this boat from getting ashore. And the American Supreme Court heard the case and found in favor of the British. They call it the Caroline precedent. And the Caroline precedent is cited to this day as a justification for preemptive self-defense. Why do I bring this up? Because NATO, in justifying its actions against Serbia in 1999, brought up Article 51 in preemptive collective self-defense. And they cited the Caroline precedent as justification. Russia has done the same thing with Ukraine. They say that this preemptive collective self-defense. What do you mean by collective? Well, we have Lugansk and Donetsk, who were Ukrainian territory, so Russia had no legal justification to intervene, declaring their independence, and that independence being recognized by Russia. So now they're independent entities that Russia can enter into a collective security agreement with. And now the threat posed by the Ukrainian military is imminent and of such a scale that Russia justifies preemption. And people say, well, that's just cute little legalisms, Ritter. You just painted a nice, ridiculous, stupid thing that certifies why we believe Russia's wrong. But now you have to put that into perspective. Let's back up now. 1990, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 1990, discussions between Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, Jim Baker, other NATO people about the future of NATO. What happens if Russian troops leave, or Soviet troops leave East Germany? And we now have the cable from James Baker to the State Department saying, we promised the Soviets that we would not expand NATO 1 inch eastward, would not do that. And yet, from the very beginning, NATO did expand. So NATO is expanding for what purpose? The purpose is to destabilize Russia, simply put, to destabilize Russia. So NATO expansion is, by intent, designed to destabilize Russia. In 2008, April, William Burns, who at that time was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, currently the CIA director, wrote a memorandum about NATO incorporating Ukraine called Niet means Niet, and basically said the Russians have made it clear that if we invite Ukraine to join NATO, this will lead to an escalation of tensions that will result in a Russian military intervention that will cost Ukraine the Donbass and Crimea. Why is this important? Because it was clear at the highest levels of American government that to invite Ukraine into NATO would lead to a conflict in Ukraine, cause effect. And yet in November of 2008, we invited Ukraine to come in, which means the United States always intended this to end in a conflict because we knew what would happen. We did it anyways. We knew it was going to end in a conflict. Now we go to 2014, the coup in Maidan, where the United States, remember Victoria Nuland's intercepted phone call? My boy, Yatsenko, handpicking a government, even though the constitutionally elected government of Viktor Yanukovych is still in power. It meant we want to overthrow him, replace him with a handpicked government to do what? To bring Ukraine into NATO. So we picked this fight. Now, it didn't go well because in September 2014, September 2014, the Ukrainian army is trapped in the Donbass. The rebels rose up. They received assistance from Russia, and they surrounded the Ukrainian army in the center of Donetsk. And the Ukrainian army, 10,000 at that time, was on the verge of being destroyed. That's when the Ukrainian president called Angela Merkel and begged, please help us, please help us. And so through the vehicle of the Normandy format, Merkel and Hollande, the French president, met with Putin and negotiated a ceasefire. A ceasefire. Now, this is at a time when Russia is ready to crush the Ukrainians. It was going to end. It was all going to be over. The Donbass would be liberated, the Ukrainian military destroyed. And Putin said, no, I choose peace. Putin said, no, I choose peace. And he chose the Minsk Accords. And Russia had been struggling ever since then to get the French and the Germans to put pressure on the Ukrainians to accept the Minsk Accords. What we know now is that from Poroshenko's mouth, Hollande's mouth, Merkel's mouth, they all say the same thing. The Minsk Accords were a sham, a lie. They were put in place not to achieve peace or a ceasefire, but to buy time for war, for NATO to train a Ukrainian army capable of liberating not only the Donbass, but Crimea, the military option. And it isn't just words there. In 2015, the United States built a military facility in Western Ukraine where every 55 days we trained a Ukrainian battalion to NATO standards. For what purpose? To go east and fight Russians in there. 55 days, one battalion, that's 30,000 troops trained in the 7 years. NATO had 2 other facilities. That's 60 to 90,000 troops trained by NATO for the sole purpose of fighting the Russians. And the Russians say, and they have the evidence to support it, that these NATO-trained troops were being massed in eastern Ukraine on the eve of the Russian decision to intervene preemptively through collective self-defense. But that doesn't mean that Russia wanted that conflict. Russia was begging. Remember in June of 2021 in Geneva, Putin met with Biden, and Putin begged Biden, please make Minsk work. If Minsk happens, all of this goes away. All of this goes away. There will be no war. And Biden said, oh, yeah, I promise you we'll do that. Didn't do it. In October, Lavrov met with his French and German counterparts and basically said, I need you to get the Ukrainians to approve Minsk. And they said, no, we can't do it. But even then, it wasn't definite war because Russia in December of 2021 gave NATO and the United States 2 draft treaties, talked about a new European security framework, which had they gone down the path of negotiating this in good faith, would have prevented a war. Russia did everything human possibly to stop this war, to prevent this war. Russia only acted when there was literally no other choice because that NATO-trained army, which from the very beginning was built for one purpose, to invade the Donbass, was massing on the Donbass. The OSCE observers there monitor the ceasefire, reported 2,000 violations, the vast majority of those violations being from Ukraine into Donbass in the weeks leading up to the Russian intervention. If Russia hadn't intervened, Ukraine would have launched an attack and they could have defeated the Donbass. So Russia had no choice. So what I tell the anti-war movement is sometimes there is a just war. Sometimes war is the answer. And that if you're truly anti-war, what you need to do is support Russia and support a Russian victory, because that's the quickest path to conflict termination. And then we can get back to peace, peaceful coexistence, etc. What is Russia's end game? A new European security framework that respects the national security interests of both Russia and Europe. What is the West's end game? The defeat of Russia, to weaken Russia to the point that Vladimir Putin's regime collapses, is replaced by a Boris Yeltsin-like clone, which will allow the United States, NATO, and Europe to disenfranchise the Russian people politically, gut them economically, and destroy them geopolitically.
Yep. I think the answer to that question was no. I don't think it could have been avoided. I think they tried to. I think Putin tried his, like you were talking about the Minsk Accords, begging, Biden. And I believe, and I read this, and Fam, you might have a little bit more insight to it now, is that there were a lot of people within Russia that were really pissed at Putin for not intervening, for dragging his feet. Even when, what's his name, Yanukovych was fleeing, he was telling Putin, hey, man, you're going to have to get involved over here because these people in the Donbass, they're going to get slaughtered if you don't. So I think he did everything possible to avoid war, but he couldn't. It just came to a point where it's like, all right, you effed around. Now it's time to find out. We have to make a move. Scott, thank you so much for hanging in there. I just want one last question because a lot of people don't know some of the history. You were the chief UN inspector over in Iraq. You were screaming that there were no weapons of mass destruction, which became weapons of mass distraction. My question is actually about Latin America. Since you know the FBI and the CIA so well, We see Donald Trump last week come out and talk about, when I get back in power, I am going to declare the cartels a foreign enemy combatant. Therefore, they can go into Latin America. They can do what they want. To me, it's all about a distraction, looking at their resources, wanting those resources, and having a way to justify going in. And what better boogeyman than the cartels? I have said before, we've looked at Iran-Contra scandal. We understand who's pulling the strings. Pedro Castillo, when he was running for office in Peru before he got in, he had pointed to the DEA. He had pointed to the CIA and their involvement in the drug trade in Latin America. For the love of God, Scott Ritter, who controls the drug trade in Latin America, the CIA or the cartels?
Both. The cartels work for the CIA.
Oh, could you say that again?
Both. The cartels work for the CIA.
Thank you. That's my question. That's all I got. That's all my question. So we understand pulling the strings there, because this is really, really scary. So it would be unfair to classify them as an enemy combatant, because you'd have to classify the CIA as an enemy combatant. Is that how it would work? What's your thoughts there?
Now we're getting into, legal. What I can tell you about the CIA is the following: they have no morals, they have no scruples. They'll do anything to further what they deem to be the advantage of the United States. And because drugs and drug cartels are, they involve a lot of money, and money is interlinked with politics. The CIA is able to leverage drug money into control over much of South America, much of Central America, and indeed some people even speculate much of America. The CIA is behind the scenes doing things. It's not that they actually do the daily planning on behalf of the cartels. It's that they enable the cartels to do what they're doing. They don't, instead of using the information they collect to help destroy the cartels, they use that information to further legend. The CIA is in the human intelligence business. That means their job is to find individuals, break them, and get them to work on behalf of the United States of America. And the drug cartel business and everything that's associated with that, human trafficking, organ trafficking, prostitution, the whole works, is all controlled by CIA case officers who use that to exploit human weaknesses so they can build their stable of human sources.
Scott Ritter, thank you so much.
Thank you, Scott, so much. Do you have anything coming up or anything you want to let the audience know?
No, I mean, I did have that speaking engagement in New York City, but it got canceled. I do have if you go to scottritterextra.com, you can find all the stuff that I write. You can find various podcasts, including, if you guys link this to me, I'll put it up there as well. And I have a Substack, so if people want to support me through the Substack, that would be, very helpful. But, that's it. I thank you very much for having me on, and I look forward to hopefully coming back on at a future date to discuss this issue, which I don't think is going away anytime soon.
You have a great show with Garland Nixon, by the way, on Rokfin. It is amazing. How many days do you guys do that one?
Oh, we only do it once a week. We do it Wednesday mornings at 9:00.
Awesome show. Awesome show.
Thank you.
Scott Ritter, ladies and gentlemen.
All right. Feel better, Scott. See you next time.
Bye, Scott.
Thank you.